1857. Deer Lodge Valley, Montana Territory. Johnny Grant winters his first cattle here successfully. 2 years after the Treaty of Hellgate moved the Salish, Pend-d'Oreille, and Kootenai peoples onto the Flathead Reservation, a Métis trader claims a valley that for generations served as a travel corridor between mountain homelands and buffalo plains. Within a decade, this ranch will anchor a cattle empire sprawling across 10 million acres. Within a century, the National Park Service will preserve it as a working ranch inside the largest Superfund complex in the United States. The question threading through every fence post and contaminated acre: what does it mean to preserve a way of life built on displacement, and can a heritage site survive the consequences of the industry it celebrates? Chapter 1. The Clearing. Walk the Deer Lodge Valley floor today, and you cross ground that once moved freely beneath the feet of 5 nations. The Clispe, the Kalispel, knew these grasslands as part of their seasonal circuit, a place where elevation and water created conditions different from the high country or the river gorges. The Skellicswu, the Salish people often called Flathead, traveled this corridor between their western territories and the buffalo ranges beyond the mountains, following routes their ancestors had refined over generations. The Katunaksa, the Kootenai, passed through, their movement synchronized with salmon runs and root harvests, and the cycles that made survival possible in mountain country. The Nemiapu, the Nez Perce, knew this route as one segment of longer trade networks that connected coastal peoples to plains nations. The Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfeet, crossed here, moving between their territories east of the Divide and occasional forays west, their presence marking the valley as contested space where different nations' territories overlapped. For centuries before there were property lines or grazing leases or water rights, the valley functioned as passage, a place where nations moved according to season and need and the rhythms of animals that didn't recognize borders because borders didn't exist. The Clark Fork River itself was highway and boundary, resource and barrier. Its riparian corridor supported different plant communities than the drier benches above. Its water made travel possible during dry seasons. Its fish supplemented diets dependent on hunting and gathering. The valley wasn't empty or unused. It was actively managed through burning, through selective harvest, through seasonal movement patterns that maintained its productivity. The Treaty of Hellgate negotiations began with different assumptions on each side. U.S. negotiators sought land cession and indigenous confinement to make settlement possible. Indigenous leaders sought to maintain access to traditional territories while securing promises of protection and resources. What they signed on July 16, 1855, reflected neither side's full intentions. The treaty text described boundaries and reservations and annuities. But boundaries drawn on maps by surveyors meant something different than territories understood through generations of use. Reservation confinement conflicted fundamentally with seasonal movement that defined indigenous life in the region. By 1859, when presidential proclamation formalized the agreement, the legal architecture was complete. The valley wasn't emptied overnight. Travel and presence continued, but the framework had shifted. Property law replaced seasonal use. Survey lines replaced memory paths. Federal authority replaced indigenous management of the land. The Flathead Reservation, established by the treaty, was located north and west of Deer Lodge Valley. The Salish, Pend-d'Oreille, and Kootenai peoples who signed the treaty were expected to relocate there. The valley they'd traveled through for generations became public domain, government land available for settlement and private claim. The transition from indigenous corridor to settler property wasn't instantaneous, but it was systematic. Land offices opened. Surveyors mapped the terrain into sections and townships. Prospectors and miners flooded the territory during the 1860s gold rush. Each wave of newcomers reinforced the legal transformation. By the time Johnny Grant established his cattle operation, the valley's status had changed completely. What had been managed commons became privatized range. What had been travel corridor became grazing territory claimed by whoever had capital and timing to file legal ownership. 2 years after that treaty, Johnny Grant built a house in the valley and started accumulating cattle. The timing wasn't coincidental. Treaties create opportunities. Land becomes available. Capital moves in. Grant didn't need to fight the people who'd used this valley for generations. The legal mechanism had already displaced them. The violence wasn't always visible. No gunfights marked the transition from corridor to ranch. But in 1865, the artist Granville Stewart sketched Grant's ranch and included 2 Blackfeet men standing on the lawn. The image captures something crucial. Indigenous people didn't vanish. They became visitors to land they'd always known, guests on ground that law now assigned to others. The transformation from free movement to permitted presence, that's where the violence lives, quiet and bureaucratic and absolute. By 1891, when federal agents compelled the Bitterroot Salish to move north to the Flathead Reservation, forced removal of people from their ancestral valley, the pattern was complete across western Montana. Corridors became properties. Travel routes became fence lines. The grass remained, but the people who'd managed it for generations lost the legal authority to be there. Stand in the Deer Lodge Valley today and try to see it as corridor rather than property. The fence lines that divide the landscape into ownership parcels are recent, most less than 150 years old. The survey markers that establish boundaries are arbitrary, drawn by government employees who may never have walked the ground they were mapping. Before those lines existed, movement was possible in ways that property law has since erased. The valley was passage, not possession. That understanding, lost when treaties and surveys transformed use into ownership, can't be fully recovered. But its absence shapes everything that came after. Johnny Grant's ranch didn't cause this displacement, but it couldn't have existed without it. The treaty preceded the cattle. The reservation preceded the ranch house. The legal architecture of removal created the economic opportunity for accumulation. That's the foundation of the Grant-Kohrs story. A 10-million-acre cattle empire built on land that became available only because the people who'd used it for centuries were moved aside by federal force. Chapter 2. Trade and Departure. Johnny Grant arrived in Deer Lodge Valley as a product of border economies. Born in 1831 to a world shaped by the fur trade and the Hudson's Bay Company, Grant embodied the Métis experience: French-Canadian father, Cree mother, a life lived between indigenous and European systems, fluent in the diplomacy and trade networks that connected both worlds. He married Quara, a Shoshone woman identified in regional histories as the sister of Chief Tende, a connection that linked Grant not just to indigenous family networks, but to leadership and political power among the Shoshone people. Grant wasn't a romantic cowboy. He was a capitalist operating at the intersection of collapsing and emerging economies. The fur trade was dying. Gold rushes were beginning. Immigrants traveling the Oregon Trail needed livestock, and miners in California and Idaho camps needed beef. Grant understood that the real money wasn't in finding gold, it was in feeding the people who were looking for it. In 1857, he wintered cattle in Deer Lodge Valley as a test. It worked. The grass held, the animals survived. In 1859, he returned and built a building that combined trading post and residence, commerce downstairs, living quarters above. The building still stands, incorporated into the ranch house that exists today, a physical reminder that this place began as a business, not a home. Grant recruited other Métis families to join him: Louis Deschenaux, Léon Quesnel, Louis de Mer, David Comtois, Michael Leclerc. These weren't isolated homesteaders, they were a network, connected by language and kinship, and shared experience navigating between indigenous and settler worlds. They created a small metis economy in the valley, trading and ranching and surviving by understanding multiple systems simultaneously. By the early 1860s, Grant's operation had expanded dramatically. A Métis heritage compilation documents his holdings: 1,000 head of cattle in the late 1850s. By 1863, 4,000 head of cattle and roughly 3,000 horses. Total estimated value, $150,000. These numbers placed Grant among the wealthiest men in the territory. He hadn't struck gold. He'd grazed cattle on land that treaties had cleared and sold beef to miners who needed to eat. The foundation of his wealth was timing and access, being in the valley when it became legally available and having the capital and connections to exploit that availability. But the same gold rush that created markets for Grant's cattle also created pressures that pushed him out. New settlers arrived. English became the language of contracts and courts. Tax collectors appeared. Law enforcement shifted from informal frontier justice to territorial administration. Grant, who'd thrived in the fluid economies of fur trade and immigrant supply, found himself in a world increasingly hostile to the flexibility that had made him successful. In the year he decided to leave, revenue officers seized 700 gallons of alcohol from his holdings. The detail matters. It's specific, visual, and enormous. 700 gallons suggests commercial-scale operations. The seizure suggests Grant was on the wrong side of a legal system he couldn't navigate or control. The indigenous and Métis networks that had sustained him were being replaced by bureaucratic authority that spoke only English and recognized only certain kinds of ownership. In 1867, Grant's wife Cora died of tuberculosis. The personal tragedy coincided with the economic and legal pressures. Grant sold the ranch and its cattle to Conrad Kohrs for roughly $19,000. A fraction of the property's peak value, but enough to fund an exit. He left the valley with a Métis exodus: 500 horses, 62 wagons, 12 carts, 106 men. It was a migration, not a retirement, a whole community rolling out of a valley that no longer recognized them as belonging. Grant moved north into Canada, eventually settling in what would become Alberta. He died in 1907, 40 years after leaving Montana. His departure marked the end of one kind of West, multilingual, kinship-based, operating between systems, and the beginning of another, English only, legally formalized, built on exclusive ownership and industrial-scale exploitation. The ranch he left behind would become the headquarters of a cattle empire larger than any nation Grant had known. Conrad Kohrs arrived in Montana in the early 1860s, following the same pattern as thousands of others. Gold Rush immigrant becomes permanent resident. Born in Wewelsfleth, Holstein, then under Danish rule, Kohrs moved through the western territories chasing opportunity. He didn't find wealth in gold, he found it in beef. Miners need to eat. Mining camps create instant markets. Kohrs recognized that feeding thousands of men was more reliable than searching for precious metals. He started as a butcher, buying cattle and selling meat. By 1866, he had enough capital to purchase Johnny Grant's ranch and livestock holdings. The transaction was more than a property sale. It was a transfer of infrastructure. Kohrs inherited Grant's buildings, his grass, his water access, and his position as the valley's anchor rancher. The numbers define the scale. 10 million acres of grazing range spread across 4 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Not owned, the key to understanding the open-range empire is recognizing that Kohrs didn't need to own the land. He needed to control it, to be first to it each season, to maintain enough cattle and enough presence that competitors couldn't displace him. 50,000 head of cattle at peak operations, 10,000 head shipped annually to the Union stockyards in Chicago. These figures transformed Montana beef from a regional commodity to a national product. The logistics reveal the system's complexity. In 1870, Kohrs organized a drive that demonstrated the empire's geographic spread and operational sophistication. In spring 1870, fat cattle from the Sun River herd were driven over Lewis and Clark Pass toward Missoula. Additional cattle added in the Bitterroot Valley brought the total to roughly 2,000 head. Then the herd moved south into Idaho, into northeastern Utah, east toward Cheyenne, Wyoming, and finally toward rail connections and major markets. The drive crossed mountain passes, river valleys, and desert stretches. It required knowledge of grass conditions, water sources, and seasonal weather patterns. It required workers who could manage animals across hundreds of miles of changing terrain. One drive tells a different kind of story. A herd of 2,500 trailed north from Texas. Near the Snake River, a bear startled the cattle. Stampede. Horses tore loose. The outfit was left afoot in the middle of nowhere. Kohrs' cattle scattered across the region, showing up later in roundups run by other outfits. The detail matters because it shows the open-range system's chaos. Animals mixed freely, ownership was often contested, recovery depended on brand recognition and informal cooperation among ranchers. The system worked, barely, held together by shared understanding of who had been in the country longest and therefore had first claim to the grass. Another drive, a 35-mile waterless stretch. Cowboys and cattle both suffering. Kohrs sold steers at $48 per head at Pine Bluff after completing the drive. Expenses totaled just over $4,000. The profit margin was substantial enough to justify the risk and labor, but thin enough that one disaster, stampede, disease, drought, could erase an entire season's work. Kohrs adapted quickly to changing conditions. In 1880, he became an early adopter of Hereford cattle in Montana. The breed's hardiness and efficient weight gain made them ideal for range conditions. Kohrs raised bulls at his Dog Creek Ranch and shipped them to various range herds for breeding. This wasn't just ranching, it was biological engineering applied to profit. Better genetics meant heavier animals at market, which meant better returns per head. The empire's social face was carefully constructed. The ranch house, expanded in 1890 with a major brick addition, became a stage for hospitality. Dinner parties that could seat 18 to 40 people. Augusta Kohrs, Conrad's wife, telling cowboys to stop cursing around the house so her children wouldn't learn rough language first. The contrast tells the empire's story. Formal manners inside the dining room, hard language at the corrals. Refinement and brutality occupied the same property, separated by walls and class distinction. Augusta's Victorian garden remains today, preserved by the National Park Service. Geometric beds, imported plants, a space of control and order carved from the ranch's dust and chaos. The garden wasn't decoration, it was assertion. While the range remained wild and contested and dangerous, the garden represented what wealth could buy: beauty, leisure, the ability to impose European aesthetics on Western landscape. 10 million acres, 50,000 cattle, 10,000 head shipped annually to Chicago. The numbers define scale, but they also define extraction. That many animals require that much grass. That much grass requires security of access. Security of access requires legal control or de facto dominance. The empire Kohrs built wasn't just big, it was engineered to prevent competition, to occupy so much territory and maintain so much presence that other operators had to work around him, or buy from him, or give up. The system worked because land was cheap, labor was exploitable, markets were expanding, and federal policy supported Western settlement through legal mechanisms that favored capital accumulation. Kohrs thrived not because he was uniquely skilled, though he was skilled, but because he operated within a structure designed to reward exactly the kind of expansion he practiced. 4,000 cattle and 3,000 horses in Grant's peak year, $19,000 for the ranch sale, 10 million acres of claimed range, 50,000 head at Empire Peak, 2,000 head on the 1870 Long Drive, 35 miles waterless, $48 per head at Pine Bluff sale, $4,000 in drive expenses, $150,000 estimated value of Grant holdings in 1863, 700 gallons of seized alcohol, 10,000 head shipped annually to Chicago in the Kohrs era. 1870 as the year KOHRs began systematic Chicago shipments. 1880 as the year Herefords arrived at the ranch for breeding programs. 2,500 head trailed north from Texas before the stampede scattered them across the territory. But the structure had vulnerabilities. Chapter 4. The Hard Winter. The winter of 1886 to 1887 broke the open range system. Not everywhere at once, but thoroughly enough that the old model, cattle ranging freely across unfenced territory, minimal hay reserves, survival dependent on animals finding grass beneath snow, became indefensible. Cowboys told stories afterward about that winter that went beyond simple weather reporting. Some claimed the cattle knew what was coming, behaving strangely in the weeks before the first storms, bunching in unusual places, refusing to graze normally. Others spoke of the winter as judgment, punishment for taking too much from land that should have been left alone. The stories mixed with rational meteorological explanations. Unseasonably warm fall that left cattle unprepared, then brutal cold, then the crusted snow that trapped animals and prevented them from reaching grass. Whether the winter was retribution for displacement and overgrazing or simply catastrophic weather pattern, the result was identical: mass death across the range. The catastrophe was documented in grim detail. Estimates suggest 60 to 75% of Montana cattle died that winter. The losses varied by region and by how much preparation individual ranchers had made, but the overall pattern was clear. Animals froze, starved, or both. Cowboys found cattle dead in coulees, piled against fences, standing frozen where they'd stopped walking. Spring revealed the scale of destruction. Carcasses everywhere, predators and scavengers overwhelmed by the sudden abundance of dead meat. For Kohrs, the winter was devastating, but not fatal. His access to capital, specifically support from banker Andrew Davis, allowed him to survive where smaller operators failed. Credit meant he could buy replacement stock. It meant he could wait for markets to recover rather than selling immediately at depressed prices. It meant he could adapt rather than collapse. The adaptation was physical and operational. Fencing became essential. If animals couldn't range freely, they needed to be contained where hay could reach them. Hay production became critical. The valley's bottomlands and irrigable benches, previously used for seasonal grazing, were converted to hay meadows. The ranch shifted from pure ranging operation to a hybrid model: fenced pastures, supplemental feeding, controlled breeding. The transformation required infrastructure: ditches for irrigation, barns for hay storage, corrals for managing animals that no longer ranged freely. It required labor: haying crews, ditch maintenance workers, cowboys who now spent more time managing fenced pastures than riding open country. It required capital. The fencing alone represented massive expense, multiplied across thousands of acres. Kohrs's empire survived, but it changed. The 10 million acre claim remained, the brand's recognition and the family's reputation still commanded respect and influence, but the operational reality was different: more controlled, more agricultural, less spectacular, and more dependent on people whose names rarely appear in the histories celebrating the cattle barons. May 1900. The Grant-Kohrs home ranch payroll lists 10 workers: Henry Vaughn earning $40, William Stockman at 35, Antoine Menard at 35, James Meany at 25. Ham Sam, the Chinese cook, listed at $200. The record doesn't specify whether this represents 1 or 2 months' combined pay. C.P.H. Bielenberg, drawing $100, the manager's wage. By December 1900, the winter crew had shrunk. Vaughn still there, Stockman, Menard, a worker named Pinkert, Wilhelmina Schuhart, cooking in the main house. 5 people maintaining the headquarters while snow covered the valley and most operations shut down. The seasonal contraction of the workforce reveals the ranch's rhythm: big crews in summer for haying and range work, skeletal crews in winter for basic maintenance and animal care. The names matter. Not because these individuals were famous or powerful, they weren't, but because their presence complicates the mythology. The cattle empire wasn't built by romantic cowboys working freely across empty land. It was built by multi-ethnic laborers earning wages that varied dramatically based on skill, ethnicity, and employer prejudice. Ham Sam appears in multiple ranch records as the Chinese cook. His work location was the bunkhouse kitchen, feeding the ranch's labor force. The bunkhouse kitchen was not elegant. It was a functional space designed for volume production under frontier conditions, with a wood-burning stove, basic utensils, and storage limited to items that would not spoil. Ham Sam's job required rising before the workers to have breakfast ready, then preparing midday meals and evening suppers that provided enough calories for men doing hard physical labor all day: bread, beans, beef, potatoes, and coffee. The menu was repetitive because variety was not the goal. Fuel was. His role was essential. Hungry workers cannot work, and feeding 15 or 20 men 3 meals a day in frontier conditions required skill and endurance, but his wages and his status placed him firmly in the service class. The $200 that appears on the May payroll, whether representing 1 month's exceptional wages or 2 months' combined pay, was higher than most hands, but still far below management wages. And his position was isolated. He cooked. The others ate. The workers he fed were his social world, but they were not equals. They were the people he served. Chinese workers in Montana faced systematic discrimination during this period. Federal exclusion laws restricted immigration, and local ordinances limited where Chinese people could live and work. Violence against Chinese miners and laborers was common enough to create a climate of threat. Ham Sam's position at the ranch offered some security, steady employment, housing, and presumably protection through association with a powerful ranch owner, but it did not erase the broader context of anti-Chinese sentiment that shaped his daily experience. Antoine Menard's background is documented in a historic context report. Born in Quebec in 1844, Menard represented the French-Canadian migration to Montana that brought hundreds of families south from Canada during the 19th century. He worked as a handyman and gardener at the ranch, roles that sound minor but were actually critical to operations. Fence repairs meant maintaining the barriers that made post-hard winter ranching possible. Building maintenance prevented structures from degrading in Montana's harsh climate cycles. Garden cultivation produced fresh vegetables that supplemented the ranch's otherwise monotonous diet. At $35 a month, Menard's wages placed him in the middle tier, higher than general hands, lower than skilled specialists or managers. He appeared on both the May and December payrolls, suggesting year-round employment rather than seasonal hiring. That stability had value. Seasonal workers faced constant uncertainty about their next job. Year-round workers like Menard at least knew where they would be and what they would earn month to month. But year-round employment also meant year-round labor. There was always something that needed fixing, building, maintaining, or growing. Menard's tasks were never-ending. Spring meant garden preparation and early planting. Summer meant cultivation, irrigation management, and fence inspection after winter damage. Fall meant harvest and preparation for winter. Winter meant repairs and maintenance that could not be done during busy seasons. The cycle repeated every year, and each iteration required the same attention to detail and physical effort. The handyman's job was to prevent catastrophic failures through consistent attention to small problems before they became large ones. Antoine Menard died in February 1908 during routine winter fence repairs. Ranch correspondents recorded that he was found collapsed near the north pasture fence line, tools still in hand. The cause listed was exposure after a sudden temperature drop. He was 63. His body was brought back to the ranch and buried in Deer Lodge. The payroll for March 1908 no longer lists his name. A new handyman was hired by April. The ranch continued operating. Wilhelmina Schuhart cooked in the main house, the big house where the Kohrs family lived and entertained. Her work was domestic performance, meals prepared to Augusta Kohrs's standards, service executed according to the social expectations of a household trying to project refinement in a rough country. The big house kitchen was better equipped than the bunkhouse kitchen. More varied ingredients, better cookware, higher expectations for presentation. But it was also more constrained. Augusta Kohrs had specific ideas about how meals should be prepared and served. Wilhelmina's job was executing those ideas while remaining invisible enough not to disrupt the family's performance of civilized life. The separation between bunkhouse and big house was absolute. Ham Sam fed workers. Wilhelmina fed owners. The two cooks might have coordinated on supply orders or shared techniques, but their work existed in different social spheres. The distinction reflected the ranch's class structure. Labor ate one place, capital ate another, and the people doing the cooking occupied different tiers based on who they served. Wilhelmina's presence on the December payroll, but not the May payroll, suggests she might have been a seasonal worker, or that the May record is incomplete. Either way, her work was essential to maintaining the household that Augusta Kohrs was building, as a counterpoint to the ranch's rough exterior. Mitch Oxerart appears in records as a French foreman on trail drives. The foreman role required navigating distances and managing men and animals across weeks of travel. It required knowing water sources, grass conditions, terrain challenges, It required handling disputes among workers and making daily decisions about pace and route and when to push hard versus when to rest. It required enough authority to direct labor, but not enough ownership to profit beyond wages. Oxerart's success meant Kohrs's cattle arrived at market in good condition, which meant financial return that justified the drive's expense. His failure meant lost animals, exhausted men, damaged relationships with buyers, and probably unemployment. Trail drives tested men and animals through cumulative stress, day after day of movement, unpredictable weather, river crossings where cattle could drown or stampede, nights watching for predators or rustlers, limited sleep and constant alertness. The foreman carried responsibility for all of it, and his wages reflected that burden, higher than regular hands, but still wages, still dependent on the owner's decision to hire him next season. Henry Vaughan, at $40 per month, topped the hand hierarchy visible in the May payroll. The wage level suggests either exceptional skill or long tenure, or both. Lead hands earned more because they carried responsibility for directing other workers' tasks. They were intermediaries between management and labor, close enough to workers to understand conditions, but aligned with management interests enough to enforce directives. It was an uncomfortable position, too valuable to replace easily, but never secure enough to challenge management decisions. William Stockman and the worker listed as Pinkert on the December payroll appear without enough documentation to reconstruct their full stories. They were there, they worked, they earned. Then they disappeared from the available records. That incompleteness is itself revealing. Most workers at most ranches left no trace beyond payroll entries. Their labor made the empire possible, but the empire didn't preserve their individual stories. James Meany, at $25 per month, occupied the lowest wage tier among named workers. The low wage suggests either inexperience or that he performed general labor rather than specialized skills. General labor meant whatever needed doing: hauling supplies, cleaning corrals, moving equipment, assisting with any task that required extra hands. It was hardest work for lowest pay, and the workers doing it had least security and least voice in ranch decisions. The workers at Grant-Kohrs reflected the West's actual demographic composition, not the homogeneous white cowboys of mythology, but a multi-ethnic workforce drawn from Chinese immigrants, French-Canadian migrants, German settlers, Norwegian laborers, Métis families, and U.S.-born hands. They worked together not out of progressive values, but out of economic necessity. The ranch needed bodies. Immigrants and migrants needed wages. The arrangement was transactional, and the power imbalance was absolute. C.P.H. Bielenberg's $100 monthly wage, the manager's salary visible in the May payroll, was more than double the highest-paid hand. The spread from $25 to $100 reveals the ranch's internal hierarchy. Many levels of labor, one level of management, and at the top, far above these monthly wages, the owner who profited from everyone else's work. Conrad Kohrs didn't appear on the payroll because he received profits, not wages. His income came from selling cattle, from land appreciation, from capital accumulation that the workers' labor made possible, generating great profits. The workers' fates are harder to trace. Some stayed for years. Some moved on to other ranches or other regions. Some died in accidents or from disease or from conditions that went undiagnosed because medical care was scarce and expensive. The records that preserve their names in payroll ledgers rarely document what happened to them after they stopped appearing in ranch accounts. They worked, they earned, they left or died, and the ranch continued. But their labor made the empire possible. Every fence post driven into ground, every irrigation ditch dug and maintained, every load of hay cut and stacked and distributed through winter, every meal cooked to fuel other workers, every night's watch during calving season, every repair that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. The cattle empire wasn't a lone man on horseback surveying his domain. It was dozens of workers doing repetitive, exhausting, dangerous tasks for wages that kept them working but rarely allowed them to accumulate enough capital to become owners themselves. Henry Vaughan earned $40 a month. Conrad Kohrs shipped 10,000 head annually to Chicago at prices that generated massive revenue. The distance between those two numbers is the distance between labor and capital, between working and owning, between the people who built the empire and the person who claimed it. The workers made the system function. The owner claimed the profits. That's not unique to Grant-Kohrs. It is how wage labor operates everywhere. But seeing it documented in specific names and specific wages at a specific ranch makes the abstraction concrete. These were people. They had skills and needs and limitations. They worked hard. They earned little relative to the value their labor created. And then they vanished from the historical record that celebrates the empire their work built. John Bielenberg's role at Grant-Kohrs was specialized enough that it shaped ranch operations for decades. While Kohrs focused on cattle markets and financial management, Bielenberg managed the horse program that made the cattle operation possible. The Big Circle system, the term referring both to the grazing district and to the quality of horses bred for it, required animals capable of working at distances that would exhaust ordinary stock. A Big Circle horse could reportedly travel 20 miles and still have energy for gathering cattle. This wasn't recreational riding, it was endurance labor. Cowboys spent entire days in the saddle covering territory measured in sections, not acres. Horses that couldn't maintain that pace were useless. Horses that could were worth breeding. Bielenberg understood that horse quality determined whether a ranch could control its cattle or whether the cattle controlled the ranch. On open range, where animals scattered across enormous territory, you needed horses that could find them, approach them, cut individuals from groups, and manage them across distance. You needed horses calm enough to work around unpredictable cattle and tough enough to survive harsh conditions. You needed horses you could rely on day after day, season after season. The Leeds Lion Stallion barn still stands at the ranch, a log structure dating to the 1870s, named for a prized Shire draft horse. Draft horses weren't used for range work. They were power. Pulling equipment, hauling loads, doing the heavy labor that machinery would later replace. But the barn's name, preserved and documented, indicates the importance the ranch placed on specific animals with recognized value. Leeds Lion wasn't generic stock. He was breeding investment, a way of improving the quality of future generations of working horses. The Big Circle brand itself, the C within a circle, became shorthand for the ranch's operations and its reputation. The brand marked cattle, but it also marked identity. Kohrs Bielenberg stock was recognized across the region. The brand on an animal indicated where it came from, who owned it, and by extension, the quality standards associated with that operation. In a landscape where cattle mixed freely during grazing season, brand recognition was the only way to prove ownership during roundups. Bielenberg's work was patient and incremental. Breeding programs take years to show results. You select for traits, size, temperament, endurance, conformation, and you breed systematically across multiple generations. Failures are common. Success is measured in small improvements, repeated across decades. But the cumulative effect of that patient work was a horse herd that gave the ranch a competitive advantage. Better horses meant better control of cattle. Better control meant more efficient operations. More efficient operations meant higher profits. The horse program also required land. Mares and foals need pasture. Young stock needs space to develop. The ranch's capacity to dedicate acreage to horse breeding, rather than using every available acre for cattle, reflected the operation's overall prosperity. You can't afford to breed horses systematically unless the cattle side is successful enough to justify the investment. But horses were also vulnerability. An epidemic could devastate a breeding program. Injury or disease in key stallions could set back years of genetic selection. Horses required care and management beyond what cattle demanded. They were infrastructure, living infrastructure that needed feeding and shoeing and training. The Big Circle brand marked more than ownership. It marked ambition. A cattle empire spanning 10 million acres required a horse program capable of supporting that scale. Bielenberg built that program, and the ranch's survival after the hard winter owed something to the quality of the horses that allowed Kohrs to maintain operations when other ranchers were collapsing. The horses weren't romanticized creatures of cowboy mythology. They were tools, capital investments measured by their working capacity and breeding value. The ranch treated them accordingly, carefully when they were useful, practically when they weren't. The gap between the mythology of Western horsemanship and the economic reality of ranch horse programs is the gap between story and labor. Bielenberg bred work animals, not legends. 10 million acres claimed across 4 states and 2 Canadian provinces, 50,000 cattle at peak. 10,000 shipped annually to Chicago. 1870 marked the long drive over Lewis and Clark Pass. 2,500 head trailed from Texas before the bear stampede. $48 per head at Pine Bluff sale. $100 monthly for the manager. $40 for the top hand. $35 for skilled workers. $25 for general labor. $200 listed for the Chinese cook across 2 months. 1890, as the year the brick addition expanded the main house. 1844, as Antoine Menard's birth year in Quebec. 1880, as the year Herefords arrived for breeding improvement. 700 gallons of alcohol seized from Johnny Grant. 1901, as the year Bill Kohrs died at Cornell. 1920, as the year Conrad Kohrs died. Chapter 7, Vigilance and the Rope. The cattle empire required enforcement. Not just legal enforcement, though that mattered, but the kind of frontier justice that operated when courts were distant and property claims were contested, and theft was common enough to threaten profitability. In Montana Territory during the 1880s, cattle rustling was both criminal enterprise and survival strategy. For established ranchers like Kohrs, rustling represented loss of capital. Stolen animals meant lost market value. For marginal operators and drifters, rustling represented opportunity. Unbranded calves were free income if you could claim them and avoid getting caught. For indigenous people displaced from traditional hunting territories by reservation confinement and treaty restrictions, cattle theft sometimes represented survival when government rations failed or treaties weren't honored. The response from established ranchers was organized and brutal. Vigilante groups formed to protect property and punish thieves. The Montana Stock Growers Association provided institutional framework for coordinating enforcement across multiple ranches. The actions taken weren't always legal in technical terms, but they had community support among property owners who saw themselves as protecting legitimate claims against criminal threat. In June 1984, The Vigilance system reached Grant-Kohrs. The details come from contemporary ranch histories. Two men named Stinson and Cornish were hanged for rustling. The hangings weren't secret. They were deliberate and visible, meant to communicate that cattle theft would result in execution without trial. The message was aimed not just at Stinson and Cornish, but at anyone else considering similar actions. The violence was structural as much as individual. Vigilante justice operated as substitute law in places where territorial courts were weak or distant. It was applied selectively. Wealthy men who appropriated unbranded cattle as part of empire building weren't hanged, but poor men doing the same thing were. The distinction between legitimate accumulation and criminal theft was often determined by who had more power, not by any consistent legal standard. For Kohrs, the Vigilante system protected his investment. 10 million acres of range and 50,000 head of cattle generated substantial value, but only if the animals remained under his control. Loss to rustling, whether individual theft or systematic poaching, threatened profitability. The hangings at the ranch weren't aberrations. They were enforcement mechanisms within a broader system that used violence to protect property claims that themselves often rested on dubious legal foundations. The Stinson-Cornish hangings are documented, but not detailed in surviving records. We don't know their backgrounds, their motivations, or whether they actually stole cattle or were simply accused. We know they were hanged. We know it happened at the ranch. We know it was part of a regional pattern of vigilante violence aimed at establishing and maintaining property order in contested territory. The violence at Grant-Kohrs wasn't unique, but it exposes the gap between heritage site presentation and historical reality. The National Park Service preserves the ranch as symbol of Western cattle industry and frontier settlement. The interpretation emphasizes ranching operations, family history, architectural preservation. The hangings appear in historical records, but not prominently in visitor experience. The violence that protected the property is acknowledged, but not centered. That choice, what to emphasize, what to minimize, shapes how visitors understand the ranch's history. A working cattle ranch sounds pastoral. A site of vigilante execution sounds brutal. Both descriptions are accurate. The question is, which version serves as foundation for preservation and interpretation? The violence didn't end with the vigilante era. It shifted forms. Legal mechanisms replaced hangings. Water rights disputes replaced rustling conflicts. Environmental degradation replaced direct appropriation of animals. The continuity across these forms is the use of power, economic, legal, political, to protect accumulated wealth and exclude competing claims. The Stinson-Cornish hangings in June 1984 killed 2 men and sent a message. The message was clear. Property would be defended. The methods were extra-legal but effective. The consequences for the hanged men were final. The consequences for the ranch were minimal. Operations continued, profits accumulated, the empire grew. That's how frontier violence worked. Immediate for the powerless, abstract for the powerful, remembered selectively by those who later decide which stories to preserve. After the hard winter, the ranch's transformation was visible in structures and infrastructure. Buildings appeared. Hay barns for storing winter feed, equipment sheds for machinery that increasingly replaced hand labor, bunkhouses for workers who now needed year-round employment rather than seasonal hiring. The landscape itself changed. Fence lines divided what had been open range, irrigation ditches channeled water to hay meadows. The bottomlands along the Clark Fork River shifted from seasonal grazing to managed agriculture. The shift from open range to ranch farming, a term that captures the hybrid nature of the adaptation, required capital and knowledge. Fencing thousands of acres meant purchasing wire and posts and paying workers to install them. Irrigation meant surveying ditches, understanding water rights, maintaining the system against seasonal flooding and winter damage. Hay production meant acquiring mowing equipment, learning optimal cutting times, building storage capacity. The adaptation also required eliminating threats to livestock. Wolves, which had ranged freely across the valley for millennia, were systematically hunted through the late 19th century and early 20th century. Montana territorial and state governments offered bounties. $5 per wolf in the 1880s, increased to $15 by the early 1900s. Ranch records don't specify exact counts, but regional statistics document the pattern. An estimated 10,000 wolves killed across Montana between 1870 and 1930. By 1920, wolves were functionally extinct in the Deer Lodge Valley. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, and coyotes faced similar campaigns. The ecological consequences were measurable. Without apex predators, deer and elk populations exploded, then crashed from starvation and disease when their numbers exceeded carrying capacity. The range itself showed stress from decades of intensive grazing. Native bunch grasses that had evolved under periodic pressure from bison herds, animals that moved constantly, couldn't withstand year-round cattle pressure. Overgrazing reduced plant diversity, increased erosion, and allowed invasive species to colonize disturbed areas. By the 1920s, botanists documenting range conditions noted significant degradation. Blue bunch wheatgrass reduced by an estimated 60 to 70% from pre-settlement abundance. Riparian areas where cattle concentrated showed the worst damage. Stream banks collapsed, water temperatures increased without shade, fish habitat deteriorated. Water became the ranch's organizing principle. The Clark Fork River cut through the property, providing the fundamental resource that made intensive agriculture possible in Montana's semi-arid climate. The West Side Ditch, a major irrigation feature still documented in modern water rights disputes, diverted river flow to hayfields and pastures. Without that diversion, the ranch's hay production would collapse. Without hay production, winter feeding would fail. Without winter feeding, cattle operations would return to the vulnerable model that the hard winter had destroyed. Some workers spoke of the river as though it had memory and will. When the 1908 flood sent contaminated tailings across the valley, they described it not as a hydrological event, but as a deliberate act, the river reclaiming what had been taken, poisoning what had been fenced, destroying what had been built. Later floods that mobilized more slickens and damaged irrigation infrastructure reinforced the pattern. Whether the river was acting with purpose or simply following physical laws of flow and sediment transport, the result was the same. Water that had sustained the ranch became water that threatened it. The scientific explanation, flood hydrology, sediment load, channel migration, described mechanisms but didn't resolve the larger question of whether the river was responding to or simply revealing the consequences of a century of extraction. The ranch's adaptation succeeded because it had resources other operations lacked. Kohrs's access to credit meant he could invest in infrastructure during the recovery period when other ranchers were liquidating. His established market connections meant he could sell cattle when prices recovered rather than dumping stock at depressed values immediately after the winter. His political connections, membership in the Montana Stock Growers Association, relationships with territorial officials, meant he could influence policy decisions about water rights and grazing access. The workers who survived the transition carried knowledge that capital couldn't buy. Henry Vaughan, still appearing on ranch payrolls through the 1910s, understood the valley's seasonal patterns, knew where water pooled in dry years, recognized when grass was ready for cutting. His $40 monthly wage reflected that accumulated expertise. But expertise didn't translate to ownership. He remained wage labor while the infrastructure his knowledge helped build became the owner's capital asset. The family tragedy of 1901 added personal dimension to the ranch's evolution. Conrad and Augusta's son William, called Bill in family correspondence, died while attending Cornell. Some accounts cite appendicitis. Others suggest illness complicated by distance from adequate medical care. The death devastated the couple. It also eliminated the presumed heir who would have inherited and managed the empire. The ranch's future became uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with cattle markets or winter severity. Conrad Kohrs lived until 1920, but the empire's peak had passed. The open-range era was over. The massive unfenced territories where Kohrs cattle had once ranged freely were increasingly divided, claimed, settled, converted to farms or smaller ranches. The 10-million-acre claim remained part of family mythology, but the operational reality was a headquarters ranch of several thousand deeded acres, supplemented by leased grazing rights that were increasingly contested and regulated. The adaptation kept the ranch functioning, but it changed what the ranch was. The open-range empire had been spectacular in scale, but vulnerable to catastrophe. The adapted ranch farming operation was smaller, more controlled, more stable, but also less distinctive. It became one large ranch among many, rather than the anchor operation of a regional cattle empire. The buildings, constructed during this adaptation period, still stand, preserved by the National Park Service as examples of late 19th and early 20th century ranch architecture. The hay barns, the equipment sheds, the expanded ranch house with its 1890 brick addition, the corrals and loading chutes. The structures document the shift from ranging operation to agricultural enterprise, from speculation to management, from empire to estate. What the buildings don't document, what requires archival research to reconstruct, is the labor that made the adaptation possible. The ditch workers who maintained irrigation systems, the haying crews who cut and stacked tons of hay each summer, the carpenters who built the barns, the fence workers who strung thousands of miles of wire. The adaptation succeeded because dozens of workers performed repetitive, exhausting tasks season after season. Their wages appear in payroll ledgers. Their individual stories mostly don't. The ranch's survival required capital, but it also required knowledge. Understanding when to cut hay for optimal nutrition, how to maintain ditch flows at different river levels, which pastures could support cattle through different seasons. Some of that knowledge came from Conrad Kohrs' experience. Much of it came from workers who had spent decades managing the land and who understood the valley's patterns in ways that couldn't be captured in management directives. The adaptation also required accepting limits. The 10-million-acre claim was mythology by the early 20th century. The 50,000 head at peak was history. The annual shipments of 10,000 cattle to Chicago were memories. The ranch that survived was substantial, still one of the largest operations in the state, but it was measured in thousands of acres, not millions. Hundreds of cattle, not tens of thousands. That reduction in scale was success. Many operations failed entirely. The ranchers who couldn't adapt went bankrupt or sold out. The ranch that survived to be preserved by the National Park Service survived because it changed. The preservation celebrates the empire era, the open-range mythology, the cattle baron narrative, the 10-million-acre claim. But the ranch that existed long enough to be preserved was the adapted version, fenced, irrigated, managed, scaled to sustainable operations rather than speculative expansion. The distance between the mythology and the reality is the distance between preservation and history. The Park Service preserves buildings and landscapes and stories. History includes the violence and displacement and labor exploitation that made those buildings and landscapes and stories possible. Chapter 9. Poison. The Upper Clark Fork. River drainage had been mined since the 1860s, but the scale of industrial extraction exploded in the 1880s when Butte became what boosters called the richest hill on Earth. Copper deposits brought capital and technology. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company and related operations transformed the landscape from mining claims to industrial complex. The consequences reached downstream into valleys that seemed far removed from the mining operations but were connected by water and air. In 1893, the Anaconda smelter began operations. The facility processed ore from Butte mines, separating copper from rock through methods that released toxic smoke across the valley. The smoke contained sulfur dioxide and particulates loaded with arsenic and other metals. It killed vegetation across thousands of acres. It damaged buildings. It sickened livestock. It created visible dead zones where nothing grew, and the air itself smelled of industry. Ranchers, including those associated with Grant-Kohrs operations, sold smoke rights to the mining companies, legal agreements that exchanged monetary compensation for accepting smoke damage to their property. The transactions were documented in county records and corporate accounts. The amounts varied based on acreage affected and damage severity, but the pattern was consistent. Ranchers accepted payment in exchange for waiving claims against the smelter. The transactions suggest both the smoke's severity and the economic pressure that made ranchers willing to accept permanent environmental harm in exchange for immediate payment. The math of smoke rights reveals the imbalance. A one-time payment or annual fee in exchange for permanent degradation of grazing land, hayfields, and water quality. For the smelter, it was cost of doing business. For the ranchers, it was choice between payment and poverty. Refusing smoke rights didn't stop the smoke, it just meant no compensation for the damage. So they signed. They took the money. And the landscape degraded year after year while the legal agreements prevented them from seeking additional damages. The poison wasn't only airborne. Mine tailings, the waste rock and sediment left after ore processing, accumulated near Butte and along waterways. The material contained high concentrations of copper, arsenic, lead, zinc, and cadmium. When properly contained, tailings pose manageable environmental risk, but containment failed repeatedly. Flash flooding in 1908 sent massive amounts of contaminated material downstream, depositing heavy metals across floodplains including ranchlands in the Deer Lodge Valley. The event was documented in contemporary accounts as catastrophic, but its long-term consequences wouldn't be fully understood for decades. 185 million cubic yards. That's the estimated total volume of tailings and waste material from a century of copper operations in the Anaconda area. To visualize that number, picture a football field covered in mining waste 170 feet deep. Then multiply that image by roughly 800. That's how much contaminated material was created, stored inadequately, and mobilized by floods into downstream ecosystems. The contaminants were specific and measurable: arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, zinc. Each metal has different toxic mechanisms and different environmental impacts. Arsenic interferes with cellular metabolism and causes cancer. Cadmium accumulates in kidneys and bones. Copper essential in small amounts, becomes toxic at high concentrations and kills aquatic life. Lead damages nervous systems. Zinc, also essential in trace amounts, becomes toxic when concentrated and prevents other nutrients from being absorbed by plants. In high concentrations, these metals prevent plant growth, poison water supplies, accumulate in animal tissue through biological magnification, and create health risks for humans. The floodplain deposits called slickens, named for their fine texture and their tendency to prevent vegetation establishment, marked the landscape with visible evidence of contamination. In some areas, mature vegetation disappeared entirely. What had been riparian habitat became barren ground where nothing could grow because the soil chemistry was fundamentally poisoned. The slickens weren't just ugly, they were ecologically dead zones. Normal floodplain soil supports diverse plant communities, willows and cottonwoods in wet areas, grasses and forbs on benches, complex root systems that stabilize banks and filter runoff. Slickens support almost nothing. The fine sediment particles pack tightly, preventing water infiltration. The metal concentrations prevent seed germination. Even pioneer species that can colonize disturbed areas can't establish in heavily contaminated slickens. The result is bare ground that erodes easily, mobilizing more contamination downstream with each flood. Ranch workers developed their own explanations for the dead zones. Some called the slickens bad ground and refused to camp near them or let animals graze the edges. They told stories about horses that went lame after crossing slickens, about dogs that wouldn't track through the barren patches, about men who sickened after spending too long working contaminated areas. The superstitions were dismissed by management as ignorance. The scientific explanation was clear enough. Heavy metal poisoning prevented biological processes. But the workers' observations, whether framed as curse or chemistry, described the same reality. Something in that ground killed living things, and the killing persisted across generations. The Grant-Kohrs ranch continued operations through this period, adapting to conditions that were slowly degrading the landscape's agricultural capacity. Hay still grew, but yields were affected. The most contaminated areas produced less biomass. Plants growing in moderately contaminated soil showed visible stress, yellowing, stunted growth, early senescence. Cattle still grazed, but the impacts of consuming contaminated forage were gradual and difficult to quantify at the time. Heavy metals accumulate in tissues. Over years of exposure, that accumulation can affect reproduction, immune function, and overall health. But connecting specific health problems to specific contamination sources was beyond the diagnostic capacity of early 20th century veterinary science. Ham Sam, cooking in the bunkhouse kitchen through the early 1900s, drew water from the ranch well and the river for daily operations. Whether he understood the contamination risk is unknown. The water looked clear. It tasted acceptable. The vegetables grown in the ranch garden, irrigated with diverted river water, showed no obvious damage. But the metals were there, invisible and accumulating. The workers ate beef from cattle that had grazed contaminated pastures. They drank from sources fed by contaminated runoff. They breathed dust from fields where slickens had formed. The exposure was constant and unrecognized. Water quality declined measurably. River sediment samples showed elevated metal concentrations. Fish populations began exhibiting deformities and population declines. Aquatic insects, the foundation of river food webs, showed reduced diversity in contaminated reaches. The river that had supported indigenous fisheries and provided water for ranching operations was becoming a toxic system where normal ecological functions were impaired. By the mid-20th century, when the ranch was being considered for historic preservation, the contamination was documented but not yet understood as Superfund-scale environmental disaster. The National Historic Landmark designation in 1960 emphasized the ranch's historic significance, its role in cattle industry development, its architectural resources, its representation of Western settlement patterns. The environmental damage was acknowledged but not central to the preservation rationale. Walk the river corridor today, and you can still identify slickens by their barren uniformity, patches where vegetation gives up trying to establish. The soil feels different underfoot, finer, denser, somehow hostile to life. During dry seasons, dust from exposed slickens carries downstream on the wind, settling on everything, invisible contamination traveling through air and water and time. The metals don't announce themselves. They're tasteless, odorless, patient. They wait in sediment for the next flood to mobilize them. They accumulate in tissue one molecule at a time. The poisoning is slow enough to ignore and permanent enough to matter. The 1970s brought federal environmental legislation, including the Superfund program, designed to identify and remediate the nation's worst contaminated sites. The Clark Fork River drainage, from Butte through Deer Lodge Valley to beyond Missoula, was eventually designated as one of the largest Superfund complexes in the United States. The Grant-Kohrs Ranch became the only National Park Service unit on the Superfund National Priorities list. 185 million cubic yards of tailings and waste, 120 miles of contaminated river reaches, 14 million acre watershed affected, 320 river miles from Butte to Missoula included in the complex. 43 miles of priority cleanup in Reach A from Warm Springs to Garrison, approximately 1,618 acres requiring assessment at Grant-Kohrs Ranch, 88 structures on contaminated ground, 53 acres of healthy vegetation remaining in heavily impacted areas, 17 plant communities identified in baseline surveys, 9,450 feet of river cutbank requiring stabilization, 5 metals tracked in remediation: arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, zinc. 1893, as the year the Anaconda smelter began operations. 1908 as the year of catastrophic flood that distributed contamination across floodplains. Thousands of acres of dead zones where smoke rights payments compensated for permanent damage. The designation is remarkable for what it reveals about the distance between preservation and environmental consequence. The ranch was being celebrated and protected as a heritage site, while simultaneously requiring toxic cleanup. The landscape being preserved as an example of cattle industry success was poisoned by the mining industry that had operated alongside, and sometimes in partnership with, those same ranching operations. The remediation efforts documented the scale of contamination. 120 miles of the Clark Fork River were affected. A 14 million acre watershed required assessment and management. 320 river miles from near Butte to near Missoula were included in the complex. Specific cleanup focused on 43 miles of Reach A from Warm Springs downstream to Garrison, the section that includes Grant-Kohrs ranch lands. The technical details matter because they quantify consequences. Approximately 185 million cubic yards of mine tailings and waste from a century of copper operations. That's not abstraction, it's physical volume, distributed across the landscape, embedded in sediment, mobilized by floods, accumulated in floodplains. The ranch sits on and in this contamination. Restoration work at the ranch included stabilizing roughly 9,450 feet of river cut banks to prevent erosion and further contamination spread. At the time of remediation planning, approximately 1,618 acres and 88 structures required assessment. Only about 53 acres of healthy, mature vegetation remained in heavily impacted areas. The baseline documentation identified 17 distinct plant communities, but many had been degraded or destroyed by contamination and disturbance. The stabilization work was an engineering intervention: rock, revegetation, grading, drainage control. The goal was preventing further damage, not restoring pre-mining conditions. The contamination is permanent. The metals don't disappear. They can be contained, covered, managed, but they remain in the landscape. Every flood event has potential to remobilize them. Every disturbance has potential to expose them. For a working ranch, the contamination creates operational constraints. Where can cattle safely graze? Which water sources are contaminated? What vegetables can be grown in the historic garden? The answers require testing, monitoring, management decisions that balance historic preservation with safety concerns. The ranch's living history mission, maintaining working cattle operations and traditional ranching practices, collides with environmental reality that makes some traditional practices dangerous. The Superfund designation also makes Grant-Kohrs unique among Western heritage sites. Other preserved ranches celebrate success without acknowledging environmental consequence. Other cattle empire museums present the industry without documenting its partnership with and vulnerability to industrial mining's toxic legacy. Grant-Kohrs can't avoid that complexity. The contamination is documented, regulated, visible in restricted areas, and ongoing monitoring requirements. The poison in the landscape reveals something fundamental about how the cattle empire worked. It wasn't independent of other extractive industries. It operated alongside them, sometimes in opposition, but often in partnership. Ranchers sold smoke rights. They sold beef to miners. They competed for water, but cooperated in political lobbying. The cattle empire and the copper empire weren't separate systems. They were interconnected parts of Western resource extraction that prioritized profit over environmental consequence. The legacy is physical and permanent. The ranch that the National Park Service preserves sits on poisoned ground. The river that feeds the irrigation system that made the ranch adaptation possible after the hard winter is contaminated. The hayfields that winter-fed the cattle that survived when open range collapsed grow on soil containing heavy metals. The living history being celebrated exists inside environmental disaster, still requiring management a century after the contamination began. That's the unresolvable tension at the heart of Grant-Kohrs Ranch. How do you preserve and celebrate a way of life that was built on and contributed to conditions that require Superfund cleanup? The question doesn't have a comfortable answer. Chapter 10: The Bull Trout Crisis. In 2022, environmental groups filed suit alleging that irrigation operations associated with Grant-Kohrs Ranch were illegally harming bull trout, a species listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The litigation wasn't abstract environmental philosophy. It was specific claim about specific water diversions causing measurable harm to specific fish populations in the Clark Fork River. Bull trout require cold, clean water and connected habitat for spawning and rearing. They're indicator species. Their presence suggests healthy stream conditions. Their absence or decline suggests degradation. By the 21st century, bull trout populations in the Clark Fork drainage had collapsed from historical levels. Dams, diversions, temperature increases, habitat fragmentation, and contamination all contributed to the decline. Stand at the headgate of the west side ditch during irrigation season and you can see the extraction happening. Water diverts from the main channel into the artificial canal. The river's flow decreases visibly downstream. The sound changes, less turbulence, quieter current. In summer, when irrigation demands peak and river flows are naturally lowest, the diversion can reduce main channel flow by half or more. Fish trying to move upstream encounter shallower, warmer, slower water. Juvenile bull trout, which need cold temperatures and high oxygen levels, struggle in the altered conditions. The diversion doesn't announce itself as fish-killing infrastructure, it's just a headgate and a ditch, water moving from one channel to another. But the cumulative impact of that diversion, repeated across dozens of similar structures along the drainage, is measured in population declines and extirpation from historical habitats. The west side ditch, which diverts water from the Clark Fork River to irrigate Grant-Kohrs ranch hayfields, reduces in-stream flow during the irrigation season. Lower flows mean warmer water temperatures. Warmer water holds less oxygen. Bull trout, adapted to cold mountain streams, suffer when temperatures rise. The diversion also creates physical barriers that can prevent fish migration. The legal framework is straightforward. The Endangered Species Act requires that federal actions, including water management on National Park Service properties, not jeopardize listed species or adversely modify critical habitat. If irrigation operations harm bull trout, they violate federal law regardless of the irrigation's historical importance or the ranch's heritage status. The plaintiffs argued that continued irrigation diversions during critical summer months were driving bull trout toward local extinction. They presented data on stream temperatures, flow rates, fish populations, and habitat conditions. They argued that the National Park Service was prioritizing the ranch's living history mission over legal obligations to protect threatened species. The litigation proceeded slowly through federal courts. In September 2025, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order halting irrigation diversions associated with the ranch. The order was based on findings that continued water diversions created immediate risk of irreparable harm to bull trout populations. The ranch's ability to maintain hay production, the foundation of its post-hard winter adaptation, was suddenly restricted by the court order. The backstory complicated the legal battle. A settlement reached in earlier litigation had included funding for upgrading the west side ditch to improve fish passage and reduce habitat impacts. The upgrades would allow continued irrigation while protecting bull trout, but funding was stopped during the Trump administration, leaving the infrastructure improvements incomplete. Without the upgrades, the choice became stark: irrigate and harm fish, or protect fish and lose irrigation. The ranch now operates under court-ordered restrictions that directly conflict with its preserved way of life. The hayfields that were converted after the hard winter to ensure cattle survival through winter can't be irrigated if irrigation kills the fish. The water rights that were established in the 19th century are now limited by 21st century environmental law. The working ranch mission that justifies National Park Service management is constrained by Endangered Species Act protections that didn't exist when the ranch was operating at empire scale. The bull trout litigation exposes the fundamental tension between heritage preservation and ecological consequence. The ranch is preserved because it represents historically significant cattle operations. Those operations required water diversions that are now harming endangered species. To preserve the ranching practices is to continue the harm. To protect the species is to change the practices. The choice reveals that preservation isn't neutral or stable. It's a decision about which values take priority when they conflict. The temporary restraining order might become a permanent injunction, or a settlement might provide funding for fish passage upgrades that allow both irrigation and species protection, or climate change might further reduce stream flows and make the conflict irresolvable. The outcome remains uncertain, but the conflict itself is instructive. The past can't be preserved without affecting the present. Heritage sites don't exist in historical amber. They exist in living landscapes, where decisions about water and species and land use have consequences beyond nostalgia. The bull trout aren't abstractions. They're physical animals whose survival depends on specific conditions that have been degraded by more than a century of ranching, mining, and development. Their threatened status is measurable. Population counts, genetic diversity, habitat quality. The question isn't whether they're threatened, the data confirms that. The question is whether their survival matters more than the continuation of irrigation practices that represent traditional ranch operations. For some stakeholders, protecting the ranch's historic character takes priority. The irrigation system is heritage infrastructure. The hayfields are cultural landscapes. Changing operations to protect fish is erasing history. For others, preventing species extinction takes priority. The fish were here before the ranch. Their survival depends on conditions the ranch has helped degrade. Heritage preservation that requires species extinction isn't preservation. It's selective history that values some outcomes while ignoring others. The litigation continues. The temporary restraining order affects ranch operations but doesn't resolve the underlying conflict. The fundamental question remains: can a working cattle ranch preserved as heritage site coexist with bull trout recovery in a river system still recovering from copper mining contamination? The question has no easy answer, and the various stakeholders have legitimate competing stakes. But the conflict reveals something crucial about Grant-Kohrs Ranch. It's not a museum of a dead past. It's an active site where the consequences of 19th-century decisions are still unfolding. The water that was diverted to build the cattle empire is the same water that bull trout need to survive. The hayfields that saved the ranch after the hard winter occupy floodplain that's critical fish habitat. The irrigation infrastructure that's now restricted by court order was built by workers whose names appear in payroll ledgers. It's not ancient history, it's documented recent past. The bull trout litigation adds another layer to the ranch's complexity. Indigenous displacement created ranch opportunity. Cattle operations required water diversion. Mining contaminated the landscape. Preservation attempts to maintain traditional practices. And now species protection restricts those same practices. The layers don't resolve into comfortable narrative. They accumulate into recognition that the consequences of resource extraction and agricultural expansion aren't finished. They are ongoing. 1855 as the Treaty of Hellgate date. 1857 as Grant's first successful winter. 1867 as Grant's sail and departure. 1884 as the Stinson Cornish hangings. 1886 through 1887 as the hard winter, 1893 as Anaconda smelter startup, 1908 as the contamination flood and Menard's death, 1920 as Conrad Kohrs' death, 1940 as Warren's preservation purchase, 1960 as National Historic Landmark designation, 1972 as site authorization, 2022 as the original bull trout lawsuit filing, 2025 as the temporary restraining order halting irrigation, 120 miles of Superfund River, 14 million acre watershed, 5 threatened indigenous nations, 9 documented workers, 60 to 75% cattle mortality in the hard winter, 10,000 wolves eliminated across Montana, 60 to 70% native grass reduction, 185 million cubic yards of tailings, 90 CFS minimum flow requirement, 1 species between survival and extinction, 1 ranch at the center of all of it. Chapter 11. What Preservation Cannot Resolve. The ranch that Conrad K. Warren purchased in 1940 was already historic. He recognized its significance. Nearly unbroken records spanning more than a century, buildings documenting ranch architecture evolution, landscapes showing the shift from open range to managed agriculture. His preservation instinct, maintaining the property rather than subdividing it, protecting documents and artifacts, eventually facilitating National Park Service acquisition, made today's heritage site possible. Without Warren's intervention, the ranch might have been sold, subdivided, developed. The buildings might have been demolished or radically altered. The records might have been scattered or destroyed. The landscape might have been converted to subdivision or shopping center. His decision to act as caretaker archivist changed what was possible for later preservation efforts. But Warren's preservation also involved choices about what to emphasize and what to minimize. The cattle empire's scale, 10 million acres, 50,000 head, regional dominance, was central to the empire narrative. The multi-ethnic labor force was acknowledged but not emphasized. The indigenous displacement that made the ranch possible was context, not centerpiece. The environmental consequences of ranching and mining were recognized but not integrated into the core story. The violence, the Stinson Cornish hangings, the vigilante system, the structural coercion of wage labor, existed in archives but not in dominant violence narrative. The National Park Service inherited those choices when it acquired and developed the site. The agency's preservation mission emphasizes significance, authenticity, interpretation. The ranch meets those criteria: nationally significant as example of cattle industry development, authentic in its structures and landscapes, interpretable through buildings and documents and working operations. But significance and authenticity are constructed through decisions about what matters, what counts, what stories get centered. The Grant-Kohrs interpretation emphasizes ranch operations, family history, architectural preservation, the living history of continued cattle management. Those emphases are defensible. They're based on substantial historical evidence and they serve educational purposes. But they also shape visitor understanding in ways that privilege certain perspectives over others. The rancher's perspective dominates. The worker's perspective appears occasionally. The indigenous perspective is marginal. The environmental perspective is recent addition. The Superfund designation forced reconsideration of the preservation narrative. You cannot maintain living history cattle operations on contaminated land without acknowledging the contamination. You cannot divert irrigation water without addressing bull trout impacts. You cannot celebrate the cattle empire's success without recognizing its partnership with and vulnerability to mining industry that poisoned the landscape. The litigation forced another reconsideration. If maintaining traditional ranching practices requires continued harm to endangered species, are those practices worth maintaining? The question challenges the entire heritage preservation model that prioritizes keeping the past alive over addressing the consequences of that past. What Grant-Kohrs Ranch preserves, then, isn't simply buildings and landscapes and ranching practices. It preserves a set of choices about which version of history matters, which stories get told, which consequences get acknowledged. The 10-million-acre cattle empire is preserved. The indigenous corridor that preceded it is interpreted. The multi-ethnic labor force that built it is documented. The environmental damage it contributed to is remediated. The species it threatens are legally protected. All these elements coexist at the site, but they don't coexist equally. Some are central, some are peripheral. The hierarchy of emphasis shapes meaning. The ranch's uniqueness among Western heritage sites is precisely this uncomfortably layered history. It can't separate ranching success from mining disaster because they occupy the same ground. It can't preserve traditional practices without confronting their environmental impacts because the impacts are regulated and monitored. It can't celebrate the cattle empire without acknowledging it was built on recently cleared indigenous land because the timeline is too close and too documented to ignore. A pattern emerges across the ranch's history that some interpret as a curse and others as an inevitable consequence of trying to preserve extractive industries as heritage. Every attempt to maintain the ranch creates new problems. Preserving the cattle operation requires water diversions that harm endangered fish. Maintaining the working landscape requires managing contamination that the work created. Celebrating the empire requires acknowledging the displacement that made the empire possible. Whether this pattern represents a fundamental incompatibility between preservation and consequence, or simply the predictable result of trying to freeze history while its impacts continue unfolding, remains unresolved. The ranch exists at the intersection of both interpretations. Other ranch heritage sites can present cleaner narratives. They can emphasize achievement without addressing displacement. They can celebrate tradition without measuring contamination. Grant-Kohrs can't, because the Superfund designation, the bull trout litigation, and the documented records of multi-ethnic labor and indigenous presence make the complexity inescapable. That makes the ranch valuable precisely because it's uncomfortable. It's a heritage site that can't retreat into mythology because reality keeps intruding. It's a preserved landscape that requires ongoing management of consequences the preservation celebrates. It's living history, constrained by endangered species protections that didn't exist when the history was being made. The question posed at the beginning of this examination remains unresolved. What does it mean to preserve a way of life built on displacement? And can a heritage site survive the consequences of the industry it celebrates? The ranch doesn't answer that question. It embodies it. Every irrigation season raises it again. Every remediation project acknowledges it. Every visitor touring the buildings walks through a landscape where the question lives in the ground, in the water, in the structures, in the archive. The cattle empire was built on land made available by treaty-based indigenous removal. Its success required multi-ethnic labor, earning wages that kept workers working but rarely allowed them to become owners. Its adaptation after the hard winter depended on water diversions now restricted by species protection law. Its landscape is contaminated by mining industry that operated alongside ranching operations in mutual exploitation of Montana's resources. Its preservation celebrates achievement while managing consequences that achievement created. There's no comfortable resolution. The ranch exists in productive tension between celebration and critique, between heritage and consequence, between preserving the past and addressing its ongoing impacts. That tension is the site's significance, not the resolution, the persistence of the question itself. What gets preserved at Grant-Kohrs isn't just ranching history. It's the unresolved relationship between how the West was built and what that building cost. The ranch forces confrontation with complexity that simpler heritage narratives avoid. It preserves not just structures and stories, but the recognition that those structures and stories exist because of displacement, labor exploitation, and environmental damage that aren't finished. They're still unfolding in court orders, remediation projects, and endangered species counts. The ranch is a heritage site and Superfund complex, preservation project and ongoing consequence, living history and dead fish, celebrated past and contested present, all simultaneously, all documented, all inescapable. That's what makes it worth preserving, not comfort, but recognition. Not resolution, but sustained engagement with questions that don't have easy answers. The ranch teaches by refusing to let visitors or preservationists or ranching advocates or environmental activists retreat into simple narratives. The indigenous nations who used Deer Lodge Valley as a corridor are now here as interpreted presence, not sovereign management. The workers who built the empire appear in payroll ledgers, not ownership records. The bull trout are protected by law but threatened by practice. The land is preserved but poisoned. The past is celebrated, but its consequences require ongoing mitigation. All of it's true. All of it exists at the site simultaneously. The preservation doesn't resolve these tensions. It maintains them, documents them, forces engagement with them. That's the Grant-Kohrs legacy. Not resolution, but complexity maintained long enough that it can't be ignored.